all of this conveys beyond the information, so-called, that's in it. It's conveying an attitude. It's conveying a posture which says, you're wrong. If you look at images of Gazans dying, the UN is now saying maybe 100,000 Palestinians killed, wounded, or missing under the rubble, right? And he's saying, yes, but if you say we need to put a stop to that, you are probably anti-Semitic and you need to grow up, essentially. And I find this so horrifying on so many levels, but it makes me angriest because it's lying to people about themselves. It's lying to us about the way we feel and what we believe and what we are capable of.
It's even worse because these columnists don't even read the reporters in their own newspapers who've done often great features, satellite imagery of neighborhood by neighborhood obliterated by Israeli American-made F-16s over Gaza, on the scene, descriptions, videos showing the screaming and the grieving, amputations without anesthesia because hospitals are being closed down because they couldn't get the essential supplies, medicines. It's not that the news part of the newspaper is failing to do its job. It's people like Bret Stephens who said in one column recently he didn't think the level of force used by the Israeli military was excessive. He then said every death in Gaza is due to Hamas, blowing apart refugee camps and schools and mosques and roads and hospitals and clinics and ambulances. That's all Hamas' fault. Right. So we have this hesitancy even by Nicholas Kristof. He's always making some good points, but every other paragraph he's backing and filling as if he's being intimidated by this defamatory slur of anti-Semitism. So there's no critique other than fair that actually takes it apart. When was the last time you saw the American Friends Committee on Legislation, the Quakers, get an op-ed in the New York Times? When is the last time you saw the editor of Middle East Report, which has been coming out for 45 years, started by two retired U.S. ambassadors to countries in the Middle East, get an op-ed? So it's not only a slant, it's an exclusion of voices. True. Now, they've had Professor Khalidi, they've had some Palestinian Americans as op-eds in terms of their own personal experience. But in terms of policy, there aren't many like Professor Khalidi who are allowed entry into the hallowed 2 pages of the New York Times. What do you think of all this?
Well, and you mentioned Kristof, and I think folks think of him as a humanitarian, and it's interesting because he wrote pieces talking about civilian casualties. He wrote pieces sort of lamenting the devastation. But then, as you say, the next paragraph, he will refer to a ceasefire as arguably, he used the words arguably, a Hamas victory. So we're talking about a ceasefire, the ending of the mass murder and violence and displacement and ethnic cleansing of Gaza. He says, well, I understand why people might want to call for that, but that would be arguably a Hamas victory. And that tells you the limits of debate. And I don't want to end without saying that at FAIR we call for all kinds of things all the time, a range of voices, an absence of censorship, a balance of perspective, stop the over-reliance on military officials. But we do assume and hope for a bedrock of humanity. And I think that a lot of listeners will have front of mind the piece by New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, in which he compared the targets of U.S. bombs to vermin. He compared the nation of Iran to a recently discovered species of parasitoid wasp, all right, that injects its eggs into live caterpillars. And the baby wasp larvae slowly eat the caterpillar from the inside out, bursting out once they have eaten their fill. This is an entire column by Thomas Friedman in the country's so-called paper of record, in which he compares Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq to caterpillars in which they have venomous eggs hatching inside of them. And he therefore calls, you're talking about bugs, you're calling people vermin. So then he says, quote, "We have no counter strategy that safely and efficiently kills the wasp without setting ceasefire to the whole jungle, close quote. This is very, very old school demonization, dehumanization. I can't believe I'm shocked every day, and I'm still shocked by this New York Times column comparing people who are currently dying under U.S.-funded and built bombs to vermin.
Especially since the prime minister, which Tom Friedman despises, Netanyahu's cabinet ministers, after October 7th, said that no food, no medicine, no electricity, no water. These are human animals, and they were described in those terms. And for Tom Friedman, who is the supposed star of foreign policy columnist in the New York Times, to pick that up shows how tone deaf he is.
It's
there's also one-sided words. Not only do they only apply, like CBS refers to Hamas terrorists, but they never refer to the massive targeted civilian deaths by Israeli state terrorism. The other thing you never hear, Janine, is do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? They're the occupied, they're the oppressed, they're the invaded, they're the ones whose houses are being bulldozed at night by Israeli military in the West Bank, of course now Gaza. And Congress, you never hear anybody in Congress except 2 or 3 people say Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. It's always Israelis have a right to defend themselves, as if other people don't have a right to defend themselves. And the columnists pick that up. They constantly say Israel has a right to defend itself. The question is, what's itself? What's its borders? That's the big question. Every country has a right to defend itself. The question is, does Palestine have a right to defend itself?
Yeah, it goes to another main absence, including of news reporting, which I agree there are excellent, exceptional, in-depth articles that talk to real people and present issues in a way that is understandable. But in general, even in reporting, there's a lack of history. So I have had people in my life say, what's a Palestinian? Palestine doesn't exist. That's not a country. Well, part of that ignorance comes from a media that don't start the clock except at last week or a month ago or 5 years ago. They don't give you the historical and the social and the international complexity and context to understand what's happening. And you're talking about language, which is, of course, something that we look at. And in this study, even of op-eds, again, where papers have the space to include a range of views, nobody is using, 1 or 2 people use the word apartheid to describe the situation in Israel-Palestine. This is a term that it has a definition, and international groups and human rights groups have a definition for that term, and they've designated this as an apartheid situation. But when media don't talk about it in those terms, even in their op-ed, well, then it makes more sense to have people say, I don't even know what even is a Palestinian. What even does that mean? There were clear calls, even during this study period, which again ended at December 6th, there were already clear calls for a ceasefire. But we only found 2 mentions of the word ceasefire in opinion columns at the New York Times and 1 at the Washington Post. So media are not just dehumanizing, but they're also not reflecting the way that people, including in the U.S., even think about these things. They are an inadequate reflection of what public opinion really is. So they're really just trying to lead folks in a particular direction rather than reporting on the way folks actually feel.
And the situation in reporting and opinion on Iran eclipses history. We toppled the popular democratically elected leader Mossadegh in the 1950s of Iran and put in, again, reinstated the Shah, the brutal Shah dictatorship for 29 years. You don't think the Iranians remember that? So when George W. Bush described Iran as part of the axis of evil with Iraq and North Korea, and then invaded Iraq, are we surprised that the Iranians are freaking out? We had the U.S. military on the east in Afghanistan. We had them on the western border of Iran. You have Israel sending lethal operations into Iran surreptitiously. We have all kinds of sanctions on Iran, all kinds of talk in jingoistic circles in the U.S., bomb Iran, get rid of the regime in Iran. And then we wonder why Iran is freaked out and wants to have allies in Lebanon and Syria. I mean, the total obliviousness. We don't ever ask the question, what if the shoe was on the other foot and we were surrounded by some massively powerful Islamic military power and behaved like that? You think we'd be sitting around twiddling our thumbs? This is the indication of empire. This is one of the markers of empire thinking. Janine,
Absolutely.
have you covered letters to the editor? How about that one? How fair are letters to the editor on this subject?
Well, we've not done a research on it, but it's a thing that I always, or recently, but it's the thing that I always say to folks, because I believe that it's still true, that the letters to the editor are some of the most read pages of the newspaper. So folks think, oh, it's sitting in the wind. It's not. If you write a letter and you get that in the paper, that is actually incredibly meaningful, because that's what a lot of folks read in the newspaper. And the other thing to say is that although we do know that they are curated, we know that they're not printing all of the critical, certainly not the letters that are critical of the media outlet itself. But we also know that newspapers in particular, we have no letters to the editor space in other media, right? It's even disappeared in television and radio. There's no talkback space anymore. But we do know that newspapers might need to get 50 letters presenting a point of view to print one of those letters. So another thing that I always encourage people to do is write that letter anyway, because even if your letter doesn't get in, your letter might be helping another letter that represents your perspective to get into the paper. So I'm glad you brought that up, because no, they don't reflect the range of opinion that exists in the country. But part of that has to do with folks' disengagement with media. A lot of folks have just given up on mainstream news media as being an accurate reflection of the world, of what they need to know, of what public opinion is. They're not there anymore, so they're not even bothering to interact with it. But I think it's worth doing, and folks should remember that that's what a lot of folks read, is those public letters to the editor.
It's worth doing for another reason in the internet age. If they don't print your letter, you can put it up on websites.
Exactly. And going to what you were saying, one of the things that is weirdest, frankly, about U.S. news media is the way they pretend that there is no international community, as though they don't understand that folks are I'm able to read the British press. I'm able to read press from sub-Saharan Africa. I'm able to see Iranian news media. So when U.S. news media say, oh, the international community is with us, well, I can push one finger and see that that's not true. So it becomes even more strange, the idea that, oh, of course the U.S. is with the international community. The whole world is behind the U.S. and whatever the U.S. is choosing to do. We know that that's not true. What we don't have in mainstream news media is an explanation, an explication of those other worldviews. They are not incorporated into the news that we are generally consuming. So we have to kind of patch it together for ourselves. Because if you just read the New York Times and the Washington Post, the U.S. is the world. We're the only good country in the world. Anything we do is democracy. Anybody we bomb, we're bombing in service to democracy. And you're just supposed to keep swallowing that. And I feel that elite news media don't understand that people are not buying it. We're not buying it anymore. And so these efforts that we're now seeing to label anyone an anti-Semite, anti-Israeli, a horrible person, and let's release a list of their names and make sure they never get jobs and never get into school. This is bizarro world censorship, and I don't know how media can continue to exist and continue putting forward this view that tries to shut everyone up who isn't saying the official prescribed view, because people aren't accepting that anymore. We understand that the U.S. is one country in a world of many countries, and we do not have a right to go around the world killing whoever we say we want to kill and saying that we're doing that in the name of democracy and human rights. The sale is not working anymore.
I wanted to ask you, the problem is a little bit more nuanced here. When I read the Times and Post, I managed to clip a lot of good articles on this whole Gaza, Palestine, Israeli war and I don't find them having any impact whatsoever on Congress. One of the reasons we started our new newspaper, the Capitol Hill Citizen, is to show what can be reported on Congress that is not official source journalism. Your group FAIR, which puts out a nice newsletter too called Extra, we'll tell you how to get it in a moment. You ever focus on the coverage of Congress in the context of different subject matters?
Well, that's interesting because one of the things that is very frustrating to us is the way that